He walked into the Meridian Motor Auction house with a thermos of gas station coffee in one hand and his daughter's drawing folded in his back pocket. The drawing was of a car, a red one. She had labeled it Daddy's Best in the careful block letters of a 7-year-old who had only recently figured out how apostrophes worked. He'd found it on the kitchen table that morning, weighted down by a butter knife, and he had stood there for a moment longer than was reasonable, looking at it before he put it away somewhere safe. His name was Callum Marsh, 41 years old, widower, owner-operator of Marsh Garage on the east edge of Tilbury, Ontario. Population 4,000, 2 Tim Hortons, and a water tower that someone had painted a loon on sometime in the 90s, and no one had gotten around to repainting since. He had spent 15 years as a senior powertrain engineer at a firm outside Windsor before his wife got sick, and the math of a corporate schedule and a 7-year-old in a hospital 40 minutes away stopped adding up. He had taken his severance and his tools, and his daughter, Mara, and he had moved back to the town where he grew up, and he had opened the garage, and that had been 4 years ago now. He was not supposed to be at the auction house today. He had come to drop off paperwork for a client, a straightforward consignment for a '68 Pontiac Parisienne that a retired schoolteacher in town had finally decided to sell. In and out, he had told himself 30 minutes. He had promised Mara he would be home before her swim lesson at 4. The auction house was a different matter entirely. Meridian Motor Auction was the kind of place that Callum had visited only twice in his life, both times as a younger man who could barely afford the registration fee. It occupied a repurposed aircraft hangar outside Brantford, with climate-controlled viewing bays and a client list that read like a who's who of collectors, estates, and the occasional professional athlete with a hobby that had gotten out of hand. The catalog for their spring sale ran to 200 pages. The reserve started where most people's annual salaries ended. He dropped off the paperwork at the consignment desk and was on his way back through the main viewing hall when he heard it. Not a sound you could describe easily. More of an absence. The particular silence that gathers around something that is very wrong with an engine. He slowed. In Bay 12, surrounded by 4 men in linen blazers and 1 woman in a charcoal suit who was holding a clipboard the way people hold clipboards when they are trying not to show how worried they are, sat a 1969 Tomaso Mangusta. Callum stopped walking entirely. The Mangusta was, and he was aware this was not a word that serious people applied to machinery, heartbreaking. It was the color of a September sky just before it makes up its mind about the weather. A deep, precise blue that seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it. The bodywork was original and unmolested, which at this mileage and this age was genuinely remarkable. The gull-wing engine covers were propped open on both sides, exposing the Ford 302 beneath, and the 302 looked like it had not run recently and had feelings about that. One of the men in the blazers was on his phone. Another was leafing through what appeared to be a thick report. The woman with the clipboard said something that Callum could not hear, and the man with the report shook his head. He should have kept walking. He told himself that twice, and kept standing there. The thing about a 302 and a Mangusta was that it was not, strictly speaking, a complicated engine. Not by modern standards. What made it interesting, what made the whole car interesting, was the placement. Ford V8 behind the driver, transaxle in the rear, weight distribution that was famously, legendarily unforgiving if you didn't know what you were doing. Mechanics who had only ever worked with nose-heavy front-engine cars found the Mangusta deeply counterintuitive. Diagnostics that should have been simple became puzzling. Problems that would have taken 20 minutes to identify in a normal vehicle could disappear behind the architecture for hours. Callum had rebuilt one in his 3rd year at Windsor. He had read everything written about them beforehand and still been surprised. He watched one of the men crouch beside the car, look at something, and then stand up and say something that made the woman press her clipboard against her chest. "Excuse me," Callum said. All 5 of them turned. He was aware, not dressed for this room. He had on his regular work jeans, his jacket that said Marsh Garage on the chest in letters that were starting to peel, and boots that had seen a full week already. He had grease under his thumbnail that the gas station restroom had not entirely resolved. "The Mangusta," he said. "What's the issue?" There was a pause that had a kind of texture to it. The woman with the clipboard looked at him the way people sometimes look at someone who has walked into the wrong meeting. Not unkindly. Just assessing. Her name, he would learn later, was Laurel Voss. She was the senior consignment manager at Meridian and had been in the business for 22 years, which meant she had seen every variety of well-meaning amateur walk up to a valuable car with opinions, and she had learned to move them along with a minimum of damage to anyone's dignity. "We have the situation under review," she said pleasantly. "Are you registered for the sale?" "No," Callum said. "I dropped off paperwork for a consignment, the Parisien." He nodded toward the desk. "I heard the car from across the room." One of the men in the blazer said very quietly to another man in a blazer, something that Callum didn't catch, but that the tone made clear enough. "We've had 3 qualified technicians look at it," Laurel said. "This morning. We have another coming this afternoon." She smiled the smile of someone who has things managed, even if the things do not currently feel managed. "Thank you for your concern." Callum looked at the engine. The 302 sat there in its bay, quiet and blue-shadowed, and he thought about the Mangusta he had rebuilt in Windsor, and about the specific afternoon in February when he and another engineer named Bryce had spent 6 hours chasing a starting fault that had turned out to be, when they finally found it, almost insultingly simple, once you knew where to look. "The fuel delivery system on a 302 in this configuration," he said, not to anyone in particular, "has a known interaction issue with the oil pressure sender placement. If the sender has developed a slow seep, which they do, at this age, you can get a phantom signal that reads as a mechanical fault when it's actually just a contaminated connection. It won't show on a standard diagnostic run because the codes are reading real data. They're just reading it wrong." Silence. Laurel lowered her clipboard a fraction. "The other common issue," Callum continued, "is the heat shielding on the fuel lines. It degrades, and when it does, you get vapor lock under extended running conditions. Car starts fine cold, runs fine for the first 15 minutes, then dies and won't restart until it cools completely. Does that match what you're seeing?" A longer silence. One of the men in blazers turned to look at the engine. "The second one," Laurel said. Yes, that's what it does." Callum nodded. He had known that before she confirmed it. He had known it when he saw the heat discoloration on the visible section of the fuel line from 8 feet away. "I can fix it," he said. The man with the report, who had not introduced himself, but who had the manner of someone who was accustomed to not having to, said, "Our technician arrives at 2. "I know," Callum said. "I'm just telling you what it is." He wrote his number on the back of a Marsh Garage business card, handed it to Laurel Voss, and left. He was home by noon. Mara was at school. The garage was quiet, the way it got on Tuesdays when his part-time help, a 19-year-old named Kevin, who had more enthusiasm than technique, but was improving steadily, had his college classes. Callum ate a sandwich standing at the workbench, looking at a carburetor he was rebuilding for a 73 Datsun 240Z, and tried to stop thinking about the Mangusta. He mostly failed at this. At 3:15, while he was on his way to pick up Mara, his phone rang. Brantford area code. The 2 o'clock technician, Laurel Voss told him, had looked at the car for 90 minutes and recommended a complete fuel system teardown. That was 3 days minimum, and the sale was in 48 hours. The owner of the car, and here her voice shifted slightly into the register of someone sharing information that is not technically theirs to share, but is doing so out of necessity, was a man named Walter Croft. He was 73 years old. He had owned the Mangusta since 1987. His wife had passed away in the winter, and the sale of the car was intended to fund the establishment of a bursary in her name at a nursing college in Hamilton, where she had trained. Callum pulled over. 48 hours, he said. The car needs to run under its own power for the preview and the sale, Laurel said. If it doesn't run, we pull it from the catalog. That's policy. I understand. The Croft estate has already paid the consignment fee. She paused. Mr. Marsh, I want to be straightforward with you. I looked you up this afternoon. Your background is. You're not what you were presenting as. I wasn't presenting as anything, he said. You're wearing a jacket that says garage on it. I own a garage. You also spent 15 years as a powertrain engineer at Hartfield Automotive Systems, she said. And before that, you have a mechanical engineering degree from Waterloo. Another pause. Why are you running a one-man shop in Tilbury? Callum watched a truck go past on the county road. My daughter has a swim lesson at 4, he said. Can we talk about the car? He picked up Mara from school. She told him about a disagreement at lunch that had been resolved by the intervention of a crossing guard who had strong opinions about sharing, and about a book she was reading that had a rabbit in it, who solved problems, and about how she had decided that when she grew up, she would like to be either a veterinarian or someone who drove the Zamboni at the arena, and she was still weighing the options. He listened to all of it. He was good at listening. His wife, Claire, had said once that he listened the way other people breathed, like it was just the default condition, not an effort. He had not known how to respond to that, which she had also found endearing, and thinking about it now, the way he always thought about it, he felt the particular ache that 4 years had not entirely smoothed. After the swim lesson, after dinner, after Mara was in bed with her rabbit book, and the small lamp she insisted on leaving on. Not because she was scared, she had been very clear, but because the rabbit needed light to read by. Callum sat at the kitchen table and called Laurel Voss back. "If I drive out tonight," he said, "and I need parts, I need someone who can authorize a purchase. I can do that. I'll need access to the car and the bay. I'll arrange it. I'll need the full service history you have on file, and any notes from the technicians this morning. I'll email them now." He packed his tools the way he always packed them, methodically, without rushing, the same way he had packed them in Windsor when a job came in last minute and needed to be right. He kissed the top of Mara's doorframe in the way he did when he left at night and she was already asleep. It was a habit that had started when she was very small and that he had never examined too closely, because some habits are better left as what they are. He drove out to Brantford. The bay was lit and quiet. A security guard let him in and showed him the light switches and said he would be at the desk if he needed anything, with the air of a man who had agreed to something without entirely understanding what it was, but was committed now. Callum stood alone with the Mangusta for a moment before he began. It was a strange thing, sometimes, the conversation that happened between a mechanic and a car that had been sitting. Not mystical, nothing like that. But there was information in the stillness, if you paid attention, the way oil settled, the particular smell of a fuel system that had been seeping rather than leaking, the faint discoloration patterns on metal that told you where heat had been living for longer than it should. He started with the oil pressure sender. It took him 40 minutes to confirm what he had suspected from across the room. The sender had developed exactly the slow seep he had described, and the contamination at the connection point had been throwing the signal just enough to mask the real fault beneath, which was the fuel line shielding, which was exactly what he had told them. He ordered parts through a supplier in Hamilton who ran a 24-hour line for restoration work. The parts arrived at 1 in the morning, driven by a teenager in a hatchback who seemed surprised to find anyone in an auction house bay at that hour, and said so. Callum thanked him, tipped him from his own wallet, and kept working. There was something he had always found clarifying about this kind of work at this hour. Not romantic. The concrete was cold, and his back would remind him tomorrow that he was 41 and not 31, but clarifying. The problem in front of him was the problem. It was fully legible. There were no variables he couldn't account for, no grief that expressed itself in ways he didn't have vocabulary for, no school forms that asked for 2 parent signatures when there was only 1 parent. The car needed what the car needed, and he either had the knowledge to provide it or he didn't. He did. He finished at 20 minutes past 4. He ran the engine for 10 minutes, then 15, then 20, monitoring temperature, fuel pressure, the sender reading. The 302 sat and ran with the smooth, settled note of a machine that has been properly sorted, which is one of the more quietly satisfying sounds in the world. He made notes, photographed his work, left a 2-page write-up on the workbench beside the car, detailing what he had found, what he had done, what parts he had used, and what, in his professional assessment, the car's current mechanical condition was. Then he drove back to Tilbury in the early dark and got 2 hours of sleep before Mara needed breakfast. He did not hear from Laurel Voss until 11 the next morning, which he spent doing a brake job on a town councilor's Subaru and trying not to calculate, for the 4th time, whether he was going to be short on the garage's property tax. When she called, she was not alone. There was a brief pause on the line, and then a voice he didn't recognize said his name. "Mr. Marsh, this is Walter Croft." The voice was old and careful, the voice of someone who had not always been 73 and remembered what it was to be younger and was making peace with the distance. "Mr. Croft, Callum said. I drove down this morning, Walter said, to see the car. Laurel told me what had happened. A pause. She also told me a little of your situation. Callum set down the brake caliper he was holding. I wanted to call you myself, Walter said. I'm not a man who lets things like this go by without saying something directly. Another pause. My wife's name was Margaret. She loved that car nearly as much as she loved anything. We took it to Nova Scotia in 1994, and she navigated the whole way with a paper atlas because the radio was out, and she said the silence suited her. His voice did not waver, but there was something in it that recognized grief and was not pretending otherwise. Thank you for what you did. Callum was quiet for a moment. How did she navigate? He asked. A short sound on the line that was almost a laugh. Beautifully, Walter said. She was always better with direction than I was. The Mangusta sold that afternoon for $87,000, which was $12,000 over the low estimate. The bursary for the nursing college in Hamilton was established the following month. Laurel Voss sent Callum a message the week after the sale to tell him this, along with a note that said Meridian would be contacting him about a consulting arrangement if he was open to it. He thought about it for 2 days. He was, he decided, open to it. That evening, Mara showed him a new drawing. She had moved on from the red car. This one was of a man at a workbench, and beside the man there was a small figure that was clearly meant to be a girl, and the small figure was holding a wrench that was roughly the same size she was. The wrench was blue. Callum looked at it for a long moment. He put it on the refrigerator, next to the one of the rabbit, and Mara told him he could only move it if he moved both, because they went together, and he said that was fine. He wasn't planning to move anything. He made dinner. She talked about the Zamboni option, which was apparently gaining on the veterinarian option, due to a conversation she'd had with the arena staff during skating. He listened the way Claire had always said he did, like breathing, like default. And the kitchen was warm, and outside it was properly dark and starting to rain, and the day had been, all told, a reasonable one. He would not have said, to anyone who asked, that he was a happy man. That wasn't quite the right word, and he had never been someone who reached for words that weren't quite right. But there was a quality to the quiet in the kitchen that he had learned to recognize. It had a solidity to it, a there-ness, the kind that comes when you have done the work you know how to do, done it right, and come home to something that mattered. He called it enough. Most nights, it was.